part in these proceedings and members of the public and the media who are joining us as well. I want to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and home to many diverse Indigenous peoples. You can watch us on YouTube at Toronto City Council Live, or follow the meeting on your computer, tablet, or smartphone at www.toronto.ca/council. Are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? And if so, please indicate the item number and the nature of the interest. And just to give people time to think about that, I will start. I have two. Number one, information and technology. I would like to declare the following interest because of my interest in the Rogers organizations, which provide telephone and cellular services, wireless devices, internet and Wi-Fi services, and television services to the City of Toronto. The interest is in the 2018 Information and Technology Operating Budget, the Toronto Police Services Budget, the Toronto Transit Commission Budget, and the Toronto Community Housing Corporation Budget, as it pertains specifically to funds allocated to expansion and provision of telephone, wireless, internet, and television services. The second one is with regard to communications and news services, and again, because of my interest in the Rogers organizations, which benefit from an external news aggregation service contracted by the City of Toronto. Specifically, the interest is in the 2018 Strategic Communications Budget as it pertains to funds allocated for the provision of news summary services provided by Canada Newswire. And that's under item Madam Clerk, under item EX 31.2, capital and operating budgets. Are there other declarations of interest? Councillor Pasternak.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Out of abundance of caution, I'd like to declare an interest in operating capital allocations for Toronto Public Library. Although my spouse is on medical leave, she is technically still an employee of Toronto Public Library. I believe there's a scattering of references to TPL, so when we vote, if you could pull those out, that'd be appreciated.
Thank you, Councillor Pasternak. Other declarations of interest? Other declarations of interest? Okay. Then we'll move straight to the agenda and deal first with rundown on the agenda. Item EX 31.1, 2018, property tax rates and related matters. Do I have somebody to remove the recommendations of staff in items EX 31.1 and EX 31.1A? Moved by Councillor Crawford. Second, Councillor Menon Wong, Deputy Mayor. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. We will hold item EX 31.2 for a presentation from staff. Item EX 31.3 is the additional City of Toronto Act reporting requirements as a result of recording of tangible assets. Again, would somebody like to move the recommendations of the Budget Committee? Moved by Councillor Crawford. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Now we will move to consider item 31.2, the 2018 capital and operating budgets, and we'll begin with a presentation from the City Manager, the Interim Chief Financial Officer, and the Executive Director of Financial Planning. What I'd like to suggest, members of the committee and councillors, is that we have round one of questions, or one round of questions, on both the capital and operating budgets, which can include questions on the new staff reports. There are staff reports being put before you on EX 31.2 AI, A1, on children's services amendments to the budget to reflect increase in provincial contributions, and item EX 31.2 AJ on the social procurement program. And then and that those questions of staff will follow the presentation and can include questions on the presentation as people wish to the staff. And then I would entertain requests for a second round of questions with the concurrence of the members of the committee. So, and then we'd proceed to speeches on the entire budget, capital, and operating. Is that satisfactory to everybody? All right, that's how we'll proceed then. And I would welcome our staff and just say in advance something that I've said before, I think not here this year, but to say thank you in advance for all the incredible work that your whole team behind you meaning not geographically today, but behind you that work with you have done all year on getting us to where we are with the budget process. It's, I know from my own exposure to it, it's a huge amount of painstaking work, and it's very much appreciated by us, and I'm sure by all the people of Toronto, all the hard work that's done on this. So, over to you, Mr. City Manager.
Thank you so much, Mayor, and let me start off by echoing the Mayor's appreciation for the really fantastic amount of work done by staff. Josie Levita, as always, has led the budget process. Joe Farag has stepped in as acting CFO. It is a long and complicated process, but I do think that staff have worked extraordinarily hard to meet the expectation of council. And I will actually start on the 4th page of the presentation and walk through. Presentation itself is very similar to last year in terms of structure. And walk through the starting point of the preliminary budget back at launch in late 2017. And staff worked hard to produce a budget that we felt was, on a preliminary basis, consistent with council expectations as we understood them at the time. And that upper left-hand quadrant there, or box, sorry, shows a number of, I think, very important points. That the preliminary budget back in late 2017 was established without any downward adjustments to service levels, no increases as well, but no service reductions at all were tabled as part of the preliminary budget. We assumed as a starting point, and respecting that this is a policy choice by this committee and a policy choice by ultimately by council in terms of residential property tax, we set as the initial marker associated with that the assumption of residential property tax increasing at the rate of inflation, that having been the city's policy over the last number of years. So we used that as a starting point, as a marker. We further incorporated the directions provided to us by, as staff, by city agencies appointed by council, and that includes TTC and TCHC. And within that, what we did was we brought in the TTC revenue package of no fare increase, using that as a baseline. So that's our starting point in terms of our understanding of council expectations. We then worked to deliver something that was, I think, very important. Council had earlier in 2017 established essentially a zero target, no net increase for city programs and agencies. Staff worked to do that, and I do think that staff were overwhelmingly successful in achieving that mark. Frankly, at the start of the 2017 budget process, we did think it would be a stretch to achieve, by and large, a net zero, impact. We were largely able to achieve that. And in fact, we were essentially able, through that process, to achieve a balanced budget. We were able to absorb virtually all of the base budget pressures in city programs. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then deliver to a budget committee at the start of the preliminary budget a modest but real positive variance of about $3.7 million. The net increase, so this is the upper right-hand box there, was very modest. The net increase was a little bit under 1%, and that was driven essentially by things that we had already bought. And they were shelter demand on city programs and prior year decisions, essentially the cost of opening, the additional level of service in the TTC associated with Toronto York subway, and debt servicing costs. And we'll talk a little bit about the debt servicing cost as we go through. But that little bit less than 1% increase as a starting point essentially reflects absolutely flat service levels, and then pushing back very, very hard on any incremental expenditures, only acknowledging that expenditure, which is in effect already happened, already legally obligated, the meeting the shelter demand, and of course the TTC and debt service cost. One of the reasons that the budget was able to show, and a very strong reason why the budget was able to show on a preliminary basis, a positive variance was the extraordinarily strong revenue support through the year. And through the year, land transfer tax increased by $85 million, and we had a further increase of $55 million in assessment growth. Assessment growth is an annual process. We do understand that will happen. The $85 million in land transfer tax is a very, very significant increase to our starting point for the preliminary budget. Having said that, we still built into the budget a small number of short-term measures. These are not large relative to prior years, and they are also decisions put in front of the preliminary budget by city boards. So TCHC has Toronto Community Housing has a bridge of about $18 million built into the 2018 budget, effectively deferring a payment in a sinking fund. Given TCHC's financial position, it simply makes no sense, they felt, from a board perspective, to make that payment. So that's deferred until at least 2020. There were also some reserve draws, particularly the TTC chose to, in order to limit its impact on the net increase, chose to withdraw about $14 million from its stabilization reserve. There is significant incremental spending in capital, and that's essentially a function of the incremental room created by two factors, one of which is Josie Levita's very, very hard work in aligning cash flow to actually directly reflect project timing and actually creating a little bit of space there. And the other, even more significant measure is the Ontario gas tax that was announced at the end of, at the beginning of 2017, actually created, 2016, excuse me, created about $1 billion of incremental room over the course of the 10-year plan. So that is the preliminary budget at launch back in late 2017. That then goes to Budget Committee, and from this point over, I'll be presenting the outcome from Budget Committee as recommended. Budget Committee, as you know, is a subcommittee of executive, so this is recommended by Budget Committee to Executive Committee. And essentially, if I can go to the bottom box there, Budget Committee indicates that recommends to this committee, to Executive, that there'll be an incremental $124 million worth of gross expenditure. That nets out to about $53 million. That includes, and then the details of that are in the sub-bullets, $94 million, of which 29 is net impact on the tax base for poverty reduction, 6 and 9, respectively, for transit improvement and safe mobility. In effect, that means that, and then there's a relatively modest increase in direct revenue, about $5.5 million available in vacancy rebate tax savings, and a direct reduction on the expense side of $1 million in the previously planned expansion for the AG. So ultimately, the highlight numbers are up in the upper right-hand section of the note, where gross expenditure goes up by 3.6% and net expenditure goes up by 3.2%. I'll walk through that box in just in the next page, which is essentially shows how those percentages get broken down by on a program basis. And city programs are now, they had been a little bit lower. They're now at 2.3%. Accountability offices continue to grow relatively strongly, albeit off a very small base. TTC grows by 4.5%. Toronto Community Housing increases at essentially the rate of inflation. Toronto Police Service and Toronto Police Service Board continue to be very strongly disciplined with a 0% increase overall. You see the rest of the numbers there. So the overall service delivery package increase of the service delivery focused programs go up by about 2.1%, or coincident with the rate of inflation. Capital financing and the operating impacts of capital financing. So to be very clear, this isn't the capital budget, this is the operating ramifications of decisions already made by Council in terms of capital financing, does continue to place pressure on the operating side, with capital from current continuing to rise in accordance with Council policy. That is a near 20% increase. Council will ultimately need to consider whether or not that is a sustainable rate of increase, and whether or not some of this might be more properly financed through debt. That will certainly be a conversation that staff will bring forward as part of the 2019 budget process. Debt charges, and again, these are debt charges for things Council has already purchased. These aren't going forward. This is already what's in the plan, continues to grow strongly at about 10%. So that's what gives the total capital financing of nearly 14%. So the overall net budget increase, as we indicated on the prior page, is 3.2%, driven a little bit by increases in programming, but mostly by increases in debt financing. The revenue picture is on the next slide. Gross revenues overall rise by 3.6%. That's the overall budget impact. That's a modest increase of about $400 million. The basis for that, and we have a chart that explains this a little bit later, so I'll graphic, so I won't spend much time on this. But again, essentially it is a function of strong MLTT growth. MLTT continued to increase in the period from the preliminary budget put forward by staff to the Budget Committee consideration. Budget Committee therefore had at its availability an approximately an extra $10 million. So the total number, not the total number, but the number available to Budget Committee was now $95 million. So that's put into the budget. Assessment, budget recommendations by Budget Committee. Assessment growth continued to rise during that period, and a relatively small tax penalty revenue increase as well. So the revenue picture available to Budget Committee continues to be overwhelmingly positive and grew even from the staff budget. Having said that, even with that growth, Budget Committee is recommending to this committee that at the start of the budget process, there be an additional reserve draw against two areas. The first being the shelters reserve to reflect the increased expenditure on shelter being undertaken in the course of this year, and the about $14 million from the tax rate stabilization fund. There's also a one-time ask from the Toronto Parking Authority for a dividend of $3.4 million. So that's the overall revenue picture. Again, essentially a function of very strong continued land transfer growth, fully incorporated into the budget, and reserve draws on the shelters and tax rate stabilization fund. To show that in graphic terms, MLTT, the total year-over-year increase, including policy change, including full annualizations, into the 2018 budget is $102 million. Provincial funding contributes an incremental $68 million. The grand total of property tax assessment growth is 68. So those are all essentially decisions that are available. Those are essentially revenue increases available without any council decision. These are things that have happened that are very positive. These are things that have happened because of the very strong performance of the provincial economy and the continued uploads and other things associated with provincial finance. As we know, the provincial finance does, the uploads do stop at the end of this year. In terms of policy choices coming from Budget Committee, the residential tax base at a starting point, obviously a choice made by this council, but is initially presented at 2.1%. User fees increase relatively slowly, relatively modestly, relative to prior years, because TTC fares are held flat through that period. And a number of other changes. Hotel tax is a policy shift. It's not particularly large. The largest one, though, is investment income and a number of other factors associated with that. So that's the basic revenue picture that supports the budget being brought to you by Budget Committee. I will spend a minute on land transfer tax reliance, because that is the strongest element of the budget. Again, consistent what was done in 2015, 2016, and 2017. All of the increase is put into the base revenue budget. There's no prudence or other factor built in. Essentially, what's happened here is that we are, by the strong performance of the residential and commercial real estate market over the course of the year, and while there was some softness in the residential numbers, that appears to have been offset by very, very strong performance in the commercial real estate market. That effectively 95, or depending on the way you look at it, $102 million worth of increase represents something like a 4% property tax increment associated with that. The concern here is that remains a potentially cyclical revenue. It has not been cyclical within the context of the City of Toronto's experience. The provincial government has had a land transfer tax for a longer period of time. It has been cyclical in the provincial experience. Some capacity to adjust bullet point is there as a marker from staff and our acting CFO, who points out that if there is softness in the number, we would initially recommend to council that they look at the $40 million part of that directed to capital as a starting point. That would require an adjustment of the capital program, but that would obviously be the starting point. I do want to emphasize that the January results are steady, and that in fact there is, a $45 million estimate, exactly on track with budget coming in just the month that's past ended. That is a lagging indicator. It is something that one of these things that you'll see any change you'll see well after, simply because price or volumes may fall, but the impact will occur later because we collect the transfers on closing, not at the time of the transaction being reported through Toronto Real Estate Board or other mechanisms. Just to spend one more minute on this, and I'll repeat the point a little bit later, but we spend a bunch of time talking about cyclical things. The budget is the reason that the 2018 budget works is not only because we didn't suffer a cyclical downturn in the numbers, but because the numbers continued to increase very, very strongly. So this is a very different budget than we had planned in the 2017 budget. The 2017, at this time last year, that gap was closed on the revenue side very, very significantly by land transfer tax. And that refers to the net pressure on page 10, and I apologize for the small print, but essentially what's happening on the outlook for 2019 and 2020. And you'll see the numbers of 301 and 217. I frankly don't put a huge amount of weight in those numbers because, as councillors have learned over time, those numbers are oftentimes worked down over the course of the year. Programs oftentimes prevent very significant pressures as part of the early budget process, and we have been able to work them down, and we're able to work them down essentially to zero on the city staff over the time. However, there are two things that have become apparent. First is that overall, by the time we're through the budget, much of those expenditures are actually realized. If they're not realized in the staff budget, they're actually realized through the incremental money put in by budget committee or by council. And the savings that staff put forward in 2017 were rejected by council, so we have not put in savings this year, again reflecting council's prior direction on that. What has actually happened, and the reason that the kind of consequences or the concerns we flagged in 2017 and in early years essentially have not been realized, is because over the last 4 years, land transfer tax has increased by $400 million. So an average increment of $100 million a year. So effectively, that is the basis of budget planning going forward. There are a couple of other notes, and I noted it in passing earlier, but this is the last year of the provincial uploads, and particularly the Ontario Works upload provides part of that positive variance of $68 million we saw earlier in terms of transfers from other governments. The same cost drivers that we saw increasing unavoidable expense in this year, particularly the debt charges, will continue to escalate in 2019 and 2020. There will need to be a policy conversation about capital from current and whether or not that continues at the same rate of increase. Page 11 then takes us to the future policy implications. And we should note that this budget does make very, very significant investment from Budget Committee, not from the staff budget, but very significant investment from the Budget Committee in core programs and capital priorities. There is incremental resources. There is a structural gap between expense and revenue. And structural gap essentially refers, if we take out the MLTT, that is a good indication of the gap, potential gap between expense and revenue on a going forward basis. Obviously, if MLTT declines, we'll have an issue, but even if MLTT does not continue to increase at the same rate, there will need to be some budget adjustments in 2019 or 2020. The obvious mechanics will that be obviously an increase in some other revenue source or a decrease in service levels. This does not necessarily have to be property tax. There are other revenue measures available to the city. And the concern I have here is not the only concern I have here is the divergence between increasing levels of service and essentially flat base budget decision making. I do want to emphasize that through the budget directions that Council has provided to us, and I'm going to reiterate, I believe, the very strong work by staff and the work we've done with Budget Committee. Total spending remains, as we adjust it, very much under control. And there are two important measures associated with that, which basically normalize for inflation and other factors. If you look at on the 12th page of the presentation, we can see that total spending when adjusted for inflation and population growth relative to 2010 is flat. It shows it going down, but in practical terms, it's essentially flat. There's been a shift in composition with TTC and other areas growing to some modest extent. Cost-shared programs reflecting provincial uploads dropping a little bit. Rate programs, again, increasing in terms of the total spending. And just to be clear, this is a chart that shows essentially the overall impact, the total footprint of the city, including the rate programs, which is, after all, how taxpayers and ratepayers feel that impact. And then it's a little bit esoteric, but to show it in terms of the affordability, in terms of the economy, how much essentially fiscal drag the city puts on the overall economy of the city. Again, the numbers are stable and actually a little bit down 2017 over 2018, reflecting that the overall economy continues to grow a little bit more rapidly than the gross city budgets. And the last chart is just simply an all-in chart, shows everything combined, just to give a sense of the total impact of the budget and recommendations from Budget Committee in front of Executive Committee. The overall impact on both expense and revenue is a little bit under $13 million. On the expense side, the vast majority of that is devoted to service delivery, and on the revenue piece, you can see the breakdown of that. This chart is just to give a sense to remind us that the City of Toronto is actually a pretty big business. That when you take it all into consideration, and this is the basis of that of the earlier per capita chart, the all-in expense, the all-in footprint of the city approaches $13 million. I'm going to pause and ask Joe Farag to walk us through the tax ramifications, and there'll be a number of other charts that Josie will take us through in terms of some of the other specifics.
Thank you, Peter. Mr. Mayor, I just have a handful of slides, and I'll be brief. The city funds its operating budget with projected revenues in the order of $12.9 billion, as shown in this slide. Most of this revenue has already been largely set through council decisions and policies, or is literally not within the control of City Council, as in, for example, federal and provincial transfer payments. In the bar graph above, looking at it from top down, you'll note that rates have already been set for Toronto Water and the solid waste program budgets. These were adopted by Council some 2 months ago. As Peter said earlier, TTC fares have been debated at the TTC board, and the board has elected to freeze the fares for 2018. User fees and fines have been optimized within Council-adopted policies, including annual escalation policies that are largely baked into the budget already. Transfers predominantly from the province, I think they account for about 93 to 95% of transfer payments, have been set by provincial program parameters. Reserves, both program as well as corporate, have been deployed to the extent possible, and these include things like employee liability reserves and insurance reserve funds. Other revenues, such as investments, income, and accommodation taxes, have been established based on recent new regulatory regimes. You may recall that council elected to proceed with the prudent investor policies, which will provide incremental revenues in the course of 2018 and beyond. As well, in this category, there is dividend income that we receive from Toronto Hydro. 2017, council elected to amend the dividend policy rate to go from 50% to 60% of previous year's hydro income. And land transfer tax, as Peter noted, we moved last year in 2017 to harmonize our rates with the province. And these, as have been previously noted, are really subject to real estate market conditions. So, which leaves us really to the largest single, biggest city revenue source, which is property taxation. And that's effectively the subject of the slides to come. So in Toronto, there are 4 major property tax classes, and the proposed tax rate increase for each of these classes is outlined in the slide. The residential tax rate increase is proposed in the 2018 budget to be 2.1%, which is in line with the cost of inflation in the City of Toronto over the course of the last 12 months. With respect to the multi-residential tax class, the province moved last year to implement a regulation to shield that tax class from any future increases, most notably in 2017 and again in 2018. With respect to the commercial and industrial tax classes, council policy has seen fit to reduce the burden on those classes, and the commercial and industrial rate increases will be 1.05 and 0.7% respectively. Overall, across all classes, the budget would propose a 1.47% increase. So these are really the implications associated with the budget, but there are other implications, and they're reflected in the following slides. MPAC, as you know, the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, assesses the value of all properties in Ontario. And the last assessment was made in January 1st of 2016, and that assessment is used for taxation years 2017, 2018, 19, and 2020. This slide illustrates for you the relative changes across all classes with respect to property values. And you can see that the multi-residential class has increased at a greater rate than the average, which would, but for the provincial regulation, have attracted considerable taxation in that class. Conversely, industrial would have faced a decrease. The next slide is really probably one of the more important ones, and it reflects the key impacts on the tax base. So the column highlighted in yellow shows the rate increase by tax class as a result of the proposed 2018 budget. Moving from there to the right, you'll see the City Building Fund. This is a levy that was adopted by council last year of 50 basis points or half a percentage point. And it's going to be applied again against all classes with the exception of the multi-res. Moving to the right, CVA and regulatory impacts are identified in the third column, as well as policy implications that I outlined earlier with respect to shifting the tax burden from commercial industrial to the residential. And that's reflected in the second to last column. The last column illustrates for you the overall cumulative impact of all of these measures, and it suggests that residential taxes on average will be increasing by 2.91% should council adopt the budget as provided for or as recommended by executive committee. The next slide illustrates for you just in bar format what I just talked about. Again, a 2.9% increase on residential and a citywide increase across all classes of 2.37%. With respect to how we're doing in terms of tax ratio implications over time, this slide illustrates for you the impact of the council-adopted policies to reduce commercial tax ratios over time. Historically, the commercial taxes were roughly 3.5 times those of residential. And so the intent of the policy is really to bring down the commercial rates down in line to the residential rates. As you can see from the slide, the orange line suggests that in 2018, the small commercial tax ratio will in fact be below the target, which was 2.5. It'll be 2.44. The green line, which illustrates the multi-residential tax ratio, also dropping to about 2.4. And this will be achieved, in fact, in 2018, some 2 years ahead of the 2020 target. The large commercial and industrial tax ratios are also decreasing, but we expect them to reach 2.5 by 2022. In terms of the implications on the average household, you can see from the slide that in 2017, the average household paid $2,825 in average municipal taxes. The budget that's before you would increase that by $82 to $2,907. Again, a 2.9% increase. This last slide illustrates how much an average homeowner will pay for the different programs and services. As you can see, roughly 80% of the tax levy funds 6 key programs, including police, TTC, debt servicing, fire, Parks and Rec, and TCHC. So that concludes the tax policy impact section of the presentation. I'm just going to pass it over to Josie, who will take you through the 2018 operating and capital budgets.
Thank you, Joe. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to take that onion and pull the layers back a few so we can just navigate through some of the numbers so you have a better, some better clarity about how the pieces all fit together. So a couple slides here really just to give you some visuals of how we started out on this process. When we opened up this budget, we ended all submissions, gave us a $1,000 million gap between our costs and our revenues, and we employed a series of strategies that's been described, and around 34% of that were reductions in our expenditures, and you have a list there of the various types of things that were incurred, including efficiencies, working with program areas and our agencies to revise their estimates. There are some bridging strategies that came forward, about $48 million, but predominantly what we were seeing in this graph is the various revenue sources that have helped balance this budget. Next slide. Another visual for you. So when we brought this budget forward, as Peter had indicated, it was balanced. The key drivers, which are on the right side, on the expenditure side, show you that we had about almost $310 million increase year over year, with the factors identified there, those that are external, those that were the result of prior year decisions, as well as a few other things, offset by those various revenue sources. And when we combine that with the tax rate increase, in fact, there was a residual that you see at the top left-hand corner in that bar chart, the blue one, of $3.7 million, which gave a bit of a head start on to Budget Committee about what it would like to fund in terms of our new and enhanced list of requests. I would like to take a moment on the next slide, and I think it's the last key point about the preliminary budget, and that's what it delivered in terms of our contributions to TCHC. So if you all recall that in 2017, what we had before us was an operating budget gap for TCHC, in which Council approved $31 million to close that gap, another $6 million to help with the Regent Park revitalization, and that really essentially stabilized the operating budget for TCHC. That continues into 2018. In fact, they have some efficiencies that are being reinvested in their own budget to help improve service levels for repairs, maintenance, and cleaning. So what we're seeing in this budget in 2018 really is an investment on the capital side. Council had asked us to come forward with a 2-year interim funding solution to address their state of good repair. And for the first time, what we have in this budget, when it was launched in the budget before you from Budget Committee, is a recommendation to include $279 million of city debt funding, which is partnered, in fact, with $120 million of provincial funding to address state of good repair for 2 years that will prevent closures for this 2-year period until such time as we deal with the tenants first strategy, and it continues those revitalization projects that are in flight. So what is before you as a committee and then as council is seeking authority to actually increase the city's contribution to TCHC as the shareholder in terms of actually borrowing debt for them. Okay, so that was the preliminary budget. This is a bit of a busy slide, but essentially if you follow it with me, it does reflect the decisions from a numeric perspective of the actions that Budget Committee took, its recommendations. So we had 2 elements that took the preliminary budget and actually reduced it by $6.5 million. One was an expenditure reduction of $1 million. The other, to remind committee, was $5.5 million that was sitting in the budget, waiting as a placeholder. It comes from the vacancy rebate decision by council last year, which essentially made that decision to eliminate the program. 50% of that money was to go to the bottom line for the city as a savings, and the other 50% to be a contribution to offset the cost and funding of poverty reduction measures as well as distressed retail measures. With the part-year implementation, that gave us another $5.5 million. So that then came out to help offset the increases. The next grouping, essentially of $53 million, are the net costs associated with the new and enhanced recommendations by the committee. And then you see in the next grouping the $29 million of funding sources that help augment that. When you take that $29 million and combine with that the $3.7 million of room, as well as the additional assessment growth based on our final roll, that balanced the budget for Budget Committee. So what we end up with is the 86% of the entire budget before you. 12.9 billion is the total city budget, and so the budget that's here for your consideration is 11.1 billion, representing 86% of the entire city budget. So just a couple of quick slides to show you where the money comes from and where the money goes. To the left, if you look at that, you can see the property tax contribution of 38%, with land transfer at 7%, as well as all the other funding sources that have already been discussed. On the right-hand side, you can see the various splits of the major programs, starting with emergency services and working your way through up to the top, about 11 o'clock on that dial, to capital and corporate financing that represents 9%. And we'll come back to why that's important. The next slide reminds folks that what's sitting in this budget is $1 billion as it relates to the operating impact of capital. So not only do we have the debt servicing charges from the borrowing of existing approved capital projects, we also have the capital from current contribution, and then we have another $38 million in fact to actually operate, maintain, sustain those capital projects once they're completed. Next slide. So here's a visual that actually allocates, it shows you kind of the scope and scale of what's been recommended in terms of our new service enhancements. We have grouped them, and in fact, if you have received various packages, there are some appendices that take these categories and identify all the new enhanced measures, either by program or by these actual themes. To identify. So most notably, of course, is our poverty reduction investment that is as high as it is as a result of our contributions and partnering with the provincial government in terms of funding. The shelter expansion, as we have heard through council and through this budget process, the need to respond to the shelter demand both on the operating side in terms of extending respite beds right through to year end, as well as the beginnings of opening 3 of 11 shelter sites. While there are many here, I think the only other one I'd like to point out for folks is the last one, which is around investments that help improve transit and safe mobility. So Budget Committee has recommended a reduction in bus overcrowding, both for peak and off-peak. So it's an assist of about $1 million this year, another $3 million next year. The 2-hour time-based transfer, the implementation of traffic enforcement, and other things such as the incident management response on expressways. So once we have funding for all these programs, we actually need people to do that work. So on the complement side, we see changes in our service delivery of about 183 positions, reductions in the base budget with augmentation based on our new and enhanced. And there are various aspects of those numbers, most notably in children's services and paramedics. We're opening a new fire station, and the TTC in particular has additional operators as well. On the capital side, the next slide, we also have an increase of 242 positions, and that is really to help support the capital works program that is before you. So just a moment on a couple of key items. As Peter has discussed, and we've discussed at length, I believe, on our land transfer tax. This is just a slide to show you kind of the overall historical perspective of what we've been budgeting, which is on the green, and the actual experience that we've been seeing in the blue. And in those early years, we were very conservative around the budget. We tried to maintain a split between what we were budgeting versus our actual experience. Where we are today is the land transfer tax represents 7% of our overall revenue sources. The $40 million that we refer to that's budgeted, that's in that number being contributed to capital, represents about a 5% buffer. So since 2015, we've been doing that practice of matching budget to actual. But going forward, and you'll see in the numbers for 19 and 20, we have assumed a zero increase to be conservative. The second last point here really is around the bridging strategies. We are lower than last year. With the gray part of the bar chart represents our expenditures, and so those have to come down significantly. The blue part of the bar represents our one-time revenue sources and reserve draws. But most of that this year is really in response to the shelter demand. $24.5 million of that $52 million is directly supporting those decisions. Finally, you saw this chart with Joe's slides, which took really the 18 distribution of the property tax bill, but this just gives you a comparison to 2017 and what that bar chart looked like last year. So we have some notable increases. So police is at zero, but we see an increase in TTC, in our development charges, of course, as we've been discussing, a little bit in fire, and shelter support and housing. The one area that is down, that's down in the 22%, but mid-range, is Toronto Employment Social Services, reflective of the upload and the last of that. And the only other notable point here is the Toronto Community Housing now is within that 78% of the tax bill. So just quickly on our outlook, I'm not going to go through these numbers, but essentially what we are seeing at a more detailed level here are estimates for our future spending of $460 million in total costs in 19 and $360 in 2020, based on some revenue sources that take us down to $301 million in 19 and $216 in the following year. But in those pressures for 2019, about $257 million of the $460 is essentially made up of the three top drivers: the reversal of our one-time bridging strategies, decision impacts from this year, as well as our capital financing. So that's the operating budget. Just quickly on our capital, again, I want to remind folks that when we launched the budget, we came forward with a capital plan that actually added $1.1 billion in additional investments. As part of our budget directions, we said that if we were able to find additional capacity, our key priorities would be high-needs social infrastructure, ensuring that we are dealing with very critical state of good repair, AOTA compliance, as well as projects that continue our progress towards modernization and innovation. And in fact, that's what we did do and deliver. So how did we do that? It's a very busy slide, but essentially we took what was this is the debt view by year of our 10-year capital plan. And essentially we compare ourselves annually as part of our planning and our debt management, what is in the budget or plan per year against our debt targets to see where we are. By a fair amount of work across this room of staff that are here, we went through every budget to try to align projects to their timing. We've implemented stage gating as was directed, and that gave us some room, particularly in 2018. And then when you take the next row, which is essentially replacing debt with gas tax, funding that freed up sufficient funding of $1.1 billion that allowed us to include those various project categories. As a result, when we look at our debt servicing, because this is a guide that we do use for both our capital planning and budgeting, as well as to try to manage our debt affordability, we started off with a program that saw 14.69% debt servicing ratio and ended up at preliminary budget at 14.73, so still well under the average 10-year of 15%. Next slide, highlights for you. Those things at the top, which were those that we brought forward as part of the preliminary budget, and then the second half of this chart identifies those projects that were added at Budget Committee. Most notably, of course, is the investment being made in adding 11 additional shelter sites for a total of about $179 million, as well as some incremental funding for Union Station and St. Lawrence North redevelopment. And the other main piece here is accelerating the Vision Zero capital works. Next slide. So as a result, what again is before you is a 10-year capital plan. The entire plan at $40 billion for the city, including its rate programs, and for your consideration, $26 billion or 65%. So the next couple slides I will just go through quickly, but it's there for your information. It just compares where the money is being spent. Both to the left is the budget for the current year, which is what we actually appropriate funds for, and on the right side is the 10-year capital plan. Very similar profiling as the prior year. Then we look at the types of projects that are being funded by our general categories, and what we're seeing here in both cases essentially is increasingly a split between state of good repair and balancing that with our service improvement and growth. So what does that do to our capital plan? Well, the spending of about $13 billion in state of good repair is a significant amount to help us maintain our existing assets in reliable shape, but that backlog is increasing regardless. And if you turn to the next slide, you can see those red arrows that indicate where we need to spend more time and focus. Of course, the challenge will be how do we balance that with state of good repair and growth projects that are also needed to address service demand and growth. So where's this money coming from? Of course, on the left side shows the capital spending or funding for the budget and its various sources, with the green ones being on your left-hand side, our debt servicing, our debt issuance, and our capital from current, representing about 45% of our funding sources. On the right-hand side, those same funding sources are again about 44%, but what we're seeing here is the impact of the policy to continue our CFC at 10%, because it rises from 12% up to 21% contribution or pay-as-you-go. And that will be part of the conversation going forward. So as a result of the 10-year capital plan, we are at, there is a debt issuance, of course, and the impact of the debt servicing associated with that. And when you look at the debt servicing and what that does over a 15-year period, we're at 14.94%, still just under the 15% 10-year average, But the point that I'd like to note for committee is the first 2 years are quite low. So we're going to have to revisit this in 2019 as we prepare for the next year's capital plan. So finally, we are in the second last step of this process today, and we'll be moving to special council on February 12th for deliberations. And you have dealt with item number 1, Mr. Mayor and committee, and now you have the budget before you. And that's the end of our presentation.
Thank you very much to all three of you, and to, of course, the whole team that backs you up. So, as indicated at the outset of the meeting, that would lead us now to have questions of staff, which would be of questions that had to do with both the presentation, but of course the presentation is meant to be a summary of the budget itself. And so I will ask first if there are members of council with us today who want to ask questions, and take a list of those, and then we'll move from there to members of the committee. Councillor Davis?
Just wondering why we're even debating this when the tax increase has already been approved. Maybe that's just a question to the mayor.
The tax increases as recommended by the Budget Committee. It was put to the committee here and they approved it in the ordinary course at 9:35 after the meeting started.
So I'm just wondering why we're even discussing the tax rate or the budget at all. It's all been approved in terms of a tax rate. Are you?
Well, if you don't have any
you,
questions, we have others who probably would like to ask questions, and so,
Yeah.
do you have questions?
Well, I don't have any question because there's no way to change this at this point. So,
Fine, we can move on then to members of the committee. It's not a problem.
thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Members of the committee wishing to ask questions? Or other members of council? I didn't see any here, but, okay, members of the committee wishing to ask questions? Councillor Shiner.
Sorry, can you explain to me page 43 again, realignment of additional debt room?
So through you, Mr. Chair, one of the key strategies that we undertook last year, as well as in this budget process, was for us to look at the estimates that have been placed in the budget and to ensure that it truly reflected the timing of which that money was going to be spent. So we worked with program areas to understand where they were in their various projects, what kind of turnaround times might be required, when that money would be necessary, and aligned the cash flow funding estimate with the timing and value. So at the end of the day, if someone had approved $100, but really at the end we were only going to spend 70, we adjusted it to 70 and moved the additional 30 forward.
So you move projects that won't get fully spent this year into future years because that's when the projects will actually get done. Is that simple terms? I'm a simple person.
So in simple terms, we didn't necessarily move projects, we just
You move that
changed the
portion of the funding of that
Yes,
project.
yes.
Okay.
And so the overall funding remains constant. All that's changing is the projection of the cash flow between years. So it becomes more back-end loaded.
I got that. Can I get page 36 up? MLTT. So am I right in 2015 budget, we had $432 million in? Is that what we had? And this year we have $818 million in as revenue?
That's correct, yes.
So we've gone up by $386 million in 4 years.
Yes.
And you said $95 million was 4% property tax increase. So this is 4 times that. We've avoided a 16% property tax increase based on the additional revenue that we're getting from the municipal land transfer tax.
Not sure that that is the way I'd phrase.
Let me rephrase it. If we just had the same MLTT, 432 million, and we had the budget now with the extra 386 million in expenditures, and we needed to get it from the tax base, property taxes, we would have to raise property taxes by $386 million? Can I, please, my questions for a minute? I'd have to raise taxes by $386 million, am I right?
Under that hypothetical construct, yes.
Okay. And if I had to raise it from property taxes, it would be 16%.
14%, just because the amount of property taxes has increased over time, but yeah.
Well, you said $95 million in your earlier slide was a 4% tax increase.
Yeah, it's,
So I divided 386 by 95, and I got 4.
yeah.
And I did that times 4 times that, so it's 16% tax increase.
Yes, and I was working off the 102 and 27, so it's a little bit less than 4%.
Or, I don't think at this point 14% or 16% is something to argue about. The Auditor General, she had asked for a $1 million increase, or was it a $1 million reduction?
It was $1.5 million increase. It was based on a direction, and what's been recommended is $500,000 in addition to what she had last year.
Will she be able to meet her entire program for this year?
We'd have to ask her that question.
And what would she, and the second question is, what is the return that we get for every dollar spent or $1 million spent in supposed efficiencies and savings?
That was a discussion at the Budget Committee, in fact, and there were some briefing notes that were identified around some
So
additional.
someone help me with the basic question through you, Mayor Tory. We're giving $1 million less, but in her recent reports, she tells us of the savings for every dollar or $1 million spent. So what would we not be getting in savings by not increasing the budget by $1 million?
You would have, through you, Mr. Chair, you'd have to speak to
Last question.
her about that.
So Mayor Tory, is there someone here that can answer it off her recent presentations?
My understanding, Councillor Schreiner, was that it was the Auditor General herself who indicated she couldn't utilize that money, but that's what I was told. But somebody may want to answer that, I don't know. Your time is up, although we are going to have the luxury, if people wish, of a second round if we need to, so you could come back to it. But is there anybody else who wants to add to what Ms. Levita said about that? Or what I said? I may not be right in what my recollection was.
I'm just trying to find out. A dollar spent could be $10 saved, so I don't.
Yeah, my understanding was
I don't
that
know
it
what
was
it
the
is.
Auditor General herself that had some comment on that, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
Well, is there nobody else who can answer a question on that? Okay, well, we'll have to take a note of that one and see if we can get somebody to answer it. Councillor Schreiner? That's a fair question. Okay, I had Councillor Pasternak next. By the way, I saw Councillor, well, he's gone now. Councillor Layton was here, and Councillor Nunziata, I had asked, and you didn't have any questions at the time. We are going to have at least the invitation for a second round, so if you had questions, we'll go back to the people who aren't members of the committee. Yeah.
Budget Committee, so I had all my questions.
Oh, thank you very much. Councillor Pasternak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And my understanding is these are global questions beyond just the presentation. We're asking about the entire budget package. My first question concerns Toronto Community Housing and, I guess, SHAPE, the Social Housing Apartment Improvement Program. Now, my notes indicate that we've got about 600 units across the portfolio that are no longer inhabitable, that need some kind of level of data good repair to make them habitable. And I'm wondering to what degree this transfer from the province can be used to get those units onto the market.
I will start if maybe.
So through the chair, I don't see TCHC here. I'll try and answer your question. There are $300 million, or there's $300 million allocated for the 4 years of the SHAPE funding, $120 million in the first year. TCHC tells us that they do have 19 projects identified and that they would be fully spent and they'll utilize all of that money in that first year.
So we don't know how many of those.
Sorry, just because, and Mr. Rafters was kind enough to answer that question and had the knowledge. I just think we should make a call, if you have questions on TCHC, to have somebody come over here. It's the budget meeting for the City of Toronto, of which there's hundreds of millions of dollars going to TCHC, and I would like to ask that somebody make a phone call to ask someone to come over here.
Yeah, you would think they'd be here, yes.
I'm astounded at that. So could somebody?
Mr. Mayor, I see that Hugh is here now.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. All right, well, all right.
Anyway, I have several questions. I don't want to spend too much time on this one, but knowing whether any of the SHAPE money will be going to get those units back on to the market is really my basis of my question.
Through Mr. Chair, the SHAPE money that's been secured so far of 80 million plus an additional 40 million is part of that 2-year interim funding that we're partnering with the province on. So at a minimum, it's to ensure there are no more closures, and we're working with the TCH on which projects they will actually be applying the total monies in the next 2 years.
So it's more of on the preventative side rather than the rehabilitation side.
State of good repair, and so we just don't know the level of detail. Oh, so we're,
We can, it's okay. We can get that. Now, when it comes to Build Toronto and I guess the TPLC, they're not paying dividends this year. Now, I see a number of about $8.6 million. They're hanging on to that to fund Create TO?
through you, Mr. Chair. The Build Toronto does pay the city a dividend, and those funds actually go into our capital financing reserve, which we use and are being used to fund this capital program. So there's an annual amount that comes to us of about $25 million. Over and above that, then, their revenues, their annual operating revenues are being used to help fund Create TO.
When it comes to the participatory budgeting project, I guess this is for PFR, it looks like it's funded out of a parkland acquisition fund, and is that the normal accounting procedure to fund capital projects out of a parkland acquisition fund?
Through you, Mr. Chair, when we initiated,
Ms. Romoff has started answering, but you're more than welcome to chime in if you can share the answer.
just at the highest level, when we initiated the 3-year pilot, we identified 3 funding sources depending on the types of projects. One was the Public Realm Reserve, the other was Parkland Dedication, the other one was Neighborhood Improvement Funds. And so as we've been going through each of the 3 years, depending on the nature of the projects, we would then go to the appropriate funding source, of which Parkland is one.
Parkland acquisition, though, isn't that derived from Section 42 funds?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, if Executive Committee remembers, the fund is actually split into acquisition and development. So the pieces that go towards participatory democracy would be taken from the development piece of that reserve, which can go towards construction, not just land acquisition.
Just very, finally, I noticed. Last question. Toronto Water, tree planting budget is going up from 1.95 million to 4.95 million. My understanding is when Toronto Water does construction and work, forestry or transportation comes in and does the tree planting. Is this a pivot or a responsibility shift?
Through Mr. Chair, I believe it's just a recommendation for consideration with the 19 budget process, that when we look at that rate budget to see whether we do go up from 1.9 to a larger contribution. So it's actually not a decision for this year. But what the Toronto Water budget has helped to fund tree planting in areas of erosion control and ravines.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Pasternak. Councillor Palacio.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Unlike previous years, there was no operating budget gap to close within this budget. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Now, however, on slide 11 of your presentation, you're talking about the structural gap that exists between the expense and the revenues, which results in a continued reliance on a one-time and measures. How do you propose to close that structural gap as we move forward, especially when we are dealing with a one-time measures there?
So I don't think we are proposing to deal with the structural gap. I think it is an annual budget cycle at this point. So we simply show to council that there is a gap between the base or core rate of expenditure growth and the base or core rate of revenue growth. That gap has been filled by the last number of years through a combination of measures. I'm frankly not that worried about some of the reserve draws. We generally are able to replenish those by use of the surplus that naturally accrues through prudent management over the course of the year. I think that the key thing that I think Council has understood for a period of time and does understand well, Councillor Scheiner's question got to the essence of it, is that the budget now and on a going forward basis is supported by a very high degree of land transfer growth. If we take that out, which is basically we project it as flat, that's probably a good approximation of the gap between the structural gap between councillors' expenditure policy and councillors' revenue policy.
So we think that, and you're referring mainly to the municipal land transfer tax reliance. Now, you did mention that there is a strong performance, especially on the residential part. Now, the concern is if the market softens, as we have clear indications. How do you forecast that gap to be closed, especially the structural one?
So this is a very important question, and I appreciate it. We do not forecast the market. We simply take the numbers as they are there, as we have done for the last number of years. As Josie indicated earlier, there had been a practice of building prudence into those numbers. We've stopped that. We now bring it in at the full value. There is an indication that during the course of 2017, there was a drop in price and volume of not a drop in price, but a drop in volume associated with with residential property, and a drop in price within the year, although still ending up higher than at the starting point of the year. That softness has been reflected to some extent in our numbers, but that softness has been overshadowed by very strong increases in commercial tax revenue. So as long as a combination of residential and commercial transactions continued at their current pace, the budget will remain as it is now. If that does not increase as it has increased in the last number of years, 2019 will be a more challenging year than 2018 has been.
On slide number 23, with regards to property tax increases, it suggested that the total impact on property tax increases is $82 per year. Now, we also have to deal with the impact that in some neighborhoods, homogeneous neighborhoods, for example, locally, in my area, there are areas where the property taxes have gone up as a result of the impact and reassessment by 30, 40, 50%. So in actuality, the property tax increases is much higher than $82 than as is suggested in this in your presentation. How do you address in terms of moving forward, especially with vulnerable people there when you have seniors and so on that they're struggling to survive, where in this case one size doesn't fit all?
Certainly. Through the chair, the city has ongoing tax policies that effectively buffer the impact of these unusual tax increases, and they're largely precipitated by current value assessment. And the two programs that we have available to us are tax cancellation, which cancels any increase in associated taxes for vulnerable citizens, namely seniors as well as those of low income. We also have a tax deferral program where we defer the tax.
I do understand that, and I have just one question on that. Now, the whole thing is capped based on the market value of the property. If the market value of the property is such where most people won't be able to get that, either the deferral or the property tax cancellation program, are we taking any action on that to assist or to increase the cap on those?
Final question.
Certainly, with respect to, there are those two programs. Beyond that, there is really nothing available to homeowners that experience significant increases. We do have programs that mitigate the impact on non-residential homeowners, but aside from the two programs that I've identified, there's nothing beyond that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Plasso. Councillor Burnside.
Thank you. Through you. I believe you said the average household tax was around $2,900.
Yes, that's correct. It's reflected on slide 23.
Right. If we didn't have the MLTT, what would that average be? I know Councillor Shiner talked about the difference from one year to the other. I believe it's about 20%, give or take.
So we currently are budgeting roughly $800 million, and for each 1 percentage point, that raises $30 million. So I think your math is
No, it's actually, no, it's about 27% then, is it?
27%.
25, 27%, okay. Which would then put it up, our average property tax, to about 3,700? 36,
Yes,
37?
there are a number of slides at the end of the presentation that compare us to others, and when we factor in MLTT revenue, we do come to the average in Ontario, which is roughly 3,700. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the gas tax, and I'm going to come back to the other stuff, but the gas tax, what's the actual amount that the province is giving to Toronto? I know you talked about the ability to spend on capital, but what's the actual annual amount of funds? And while you're looking for that, is it in line with what, I'll say, Toronto residents would be paying in additional gas tax? I think the gas tax went up by about 3.4 cents per liter. Like, is it proportionate to what Torontonians are paying in gas tax? Or do you even know?
So
because it's that additional tax that they brought in, about 3.5 cents per liter.
yeah, I think it's reflected in slide 43, sorry. And the amount is 1.9 billion over a 10-year time frame. 1.09 billion.
So about 100 million a year?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit higher than that.
Through you, Mr. Chairs, we're rising from the 2 cents we get today up to 4 cents.
So we're
it's
paying,
incrementally coming in, and it'll come up to about 158.
so we're paying 3.5 cents or 4 cents extra per liter, but we're getting about 2 cents back currently.
We'll have a total of 4 cents we're getting.
Which is actually what we're paying. Okay. You mentioned in one of the slides traffic enforcement officers. Are these the officers that are actually directing traffic?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes.
They're not actually doing enforcement.
I think that's the role title that they've been given, otherwise known as traffic wardens, but they're called.
No enforcement. Okay, thanks. You talked about the average household tax, and whether it's $2,900 or $3,700. Does that includes condominiums?
Yes, that includes all forms of residential.
Residential, okay.
Yes.
And is it fair to say that on average condominiums, when they get added into the mix, bring that average down? If you're looking at a house like a 2-story home or bungalow or whatever the case is, you add in a condominium, that brings the average down. Is that fair to say?
Through the chair, yes. The tax liability or burden, if you will, on condominiums is lower than the average, and so when you add it, it in fact does decrease the average.
Right. So do we know proportionately what Toronto has in terms of that condominium household, if you will, house mix? Like percentage of condominiums, percentage of houses? Because I want to make that comparison to the rest of the GTA. It would be my assertion that our mix is probably higher than Oshawa.
I think that's probably a fair assessment. I don't have the exact proportion of residential stock that's in the form of condominium high-rise development, but certainly we can get that fact.
Okay, so when we make those comparisons, they could be a little bit off when it looks like our property taxes, we could say it's below the average, but you know, because our average is brought down by this condominium mix, we're not completely comparing apples to apples. Is that fair to say?
So I think if we do want to have a full comparison of Toronto versus the rest of the GTA, we do need to account for the land transfer tax. We also need to account for the fact that Toronto has a relatively high business tax proportion. There's a different service mix as well. Toronto does provide very, very significant resources to services that are essentially regional services like the TTC.
Right.
And I think increasingly we're discovering that with our shelter support and housing as well.
Okay, so yeah, essentially it's not an easy, quick comparison, I guess is the point. Okay, thank you. And then I have two quick questions. One is, what's the average Toronto Island resident pay?
I think it would be one, only because it's 5 minutes.
Well, I thought if I asked for two, I might get it.
Well, there's a second round possible, but I have to enforce the rules fairly. So nice try, but one question.
Okay. What's the average Toronto Island resident pay in property tax?
I'm afraid we don't have that information before us, but we can certainly get it.
Does anyone in the room have that?
I'm looking over to the treasurer.
It's approximately $900.
Sorry. Could you just repeat that? Did you say $900 average?
That is per year.
900 annually. Okay, thank you. That question was pretty good.
Thank you. May I just clarify one thing, just because it was in an answer to a question you asked, Councillor? With respect to the traffic wardens, one of the reasons it's taken a bit longer is because they're going to be appointed as special constables, which means they will have the power to write tickets. And so to the extent that there's some enforcement possibly involved in their jobs, I certainly am hopeful they'll be able to write tickets to people who are violating the law as part of what they're doing. But they're being there to manage things generally, but they will have some enforcement powers because they will be special constables, which is how they can write tickets. Questions of staff, questions on the presentation, anything on the budget to Councillor Robinson.
The City Building Fund, I thought that was fully committed to transit. So my first question, is it? And second question is, why don't we call it a transit building fund?
Yeah. I think the council decision was to use it on infrastructure that is transit as well as housing, affordable housing. And so the exact use of that reserve, that levy, is for both purposes.
And when was that determined?
I believe it was determined at budget consideration last year,
So
January,
2016?
2017.
2017 budget.
Yes.
It's 2017 budget, but in 2016. Okay. So this year we're investing $279 million into TCHC. As well as you're saying to me, this building fund is not fully transit, which I was under the impression, my mistake, and I'm disappointed to hear that. So we're investing $279 million in TCHC plus probably taking money from the building fund. No?
So as of yet,
so can you explain that to me?
Yes, as of yet, I mean, the last year was the first tranche of the city building fund. Now it's going to be another tranche to a total of 1%. We put the proceeds from that levy into a reserve fund that is intended to fund future debt service associated with future projects. So that reserve fund has yet to be committed for a specific project. The 279 that's reflected in the capital budget is totally tax-supported debt, so that will be funded through taxes in future years.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. The staffing levels, so I know some of them are being funded by the province, but what are the overall staffing levels going up by, or being proposed for this budget year? The FTEs.
Slide 34 gives you really the complement changes by the different drivers that we identify.
What's the total?
So the total, if you don't include the Toronto Realty Agency, bottom right-hand corner, for service delivery purposes is 187.7. So what we're seeing in the base budget, so that's the first, that's the most left-hand circle, 117 down, driven by prior year decisions, operating impacts of opening new facilities, some changes in the base and efficiencies. And then when we add the new and enhanced items of 304.8 positions, we get the net increase of 187. On page, did you see that, Councillor? Yeah. So built into that, of course, we're adding paramedics that are helping with preparation, children's services for childcare growth, long-term care, resident acuity, provincially funded. We have increasing staff for lifeguards that were transferred from police. Shelter, of course, there's an additional capacity that's being recommended there, another 35. There are 13 in municipal licensing and standards for enforcement of body rubs. Fire has more for a new station, facilities, transform TO. We're opening up a new Indigenous Affairs office that's adding in the city manager's office. Clerks, 35 positions for the election. That's required for this coming year. And of course, we have some additional capacity in TTC. And finally, the theaters. With the change in governance that we've had, they're increasing their activity, and there are 44 positions for programming purposes, all built into this.
For the theaters that have been amalgamated, merged.
Yes.
I thought that was actually supposed to do the opposite, but.
No, but it's fully funded from their revenues, right? So they add positions as they increase their programming activity, and then they go depending on the events that they have. So they're not permanent in that.
No, but last year, I think that there was a check written from the city to offset some.
That was a one-time transition, and they've used it, and they didn't. It's not recurring, and they're at zero.
Great. Okay, two more questions. I see the balancing strategies. So these balancing strategies are actually to accommodate the increases, what I call them, these key investments. The balancing strategies are to address the key investments, not really to balance the budget. That's my first question. And are some of those things really the jurisdiction of the province? And my last question is fair wage. I'd like to understand the impacts of fair wage on our budgets, because yesterday I got a call from a tennis club saying they want to put in new lights. They got one quote, the city staff got a different quote, much higher. So it's really a loaded question. There's three questions in one.
And you managed to squeeze in a three-part question under the 5 minutes.
I did. That was my intent.
Councillor Burnside, he asked to do that,
Yeah.
but he was over the 5 minutes. So anyway, you started under the 5 minutes. Go ahead.
You got to learn
please
from the
answer,
master.
Ms. Levy. Thank you.
All right.
So I'll take the strategy question. So in 2018, it's a combination of pieces. What we see from the Budget Committee recommended adjustments, we see the use of the tax rate stabilization reserve and the one-time dividend from the parking authority, but that is essentially directed at the additional shelter demand and the overall investments that are being made. We did have some things in the base budget as well that were tied to some decisions that were made, like the TTC stabilization reserve, which helped bring the base budget down. As well as some other smaller pieces. We have a piece in there for childcare expansion, the occupancy grant reinstatement last year. That was a draw of 5.8 from a reserve. That's built into the base budget, and it's there for a 2-year period until such time as there are discussions with the school board on that.
So generally speaking, reserves are drawn down to reflect, if the reserve is a capital reserve, it's drawn down in response to capital. If the reserves are generally associated, or that the one-time measures are usually used when you have a belief that the next year will be better. It's slightly unusual to be touching the reserves at a time when, or the one-year strategies at a time when we have had significant revenue increases, unplanned revenue increases during the course of the year.
And my last question was about fair wage, the fair wage impacts on contracting work.
Through the chair, I mean, the city has to adhere to fair wage as part of their T's and C's. We would actually have to look at the other quote to see if it's fair wage that is the reason why one is higher than the other.
I can't even see who's talking. Who is it? Oh.
Thanks.
Oh, okay, there you are.
Oh.
Okay, thanks. That's good.
Thank you,
Yeah, I couldn't basically-
Councillor Robinson. Questions by members of the committee for any of the staff, including our presenters here. Councillor McMahon.
Thanks
Councillor
very
Barlow
much.
after that.
Good morning, everyone. So this is just a question actually for, well, for me, but for Councillor Layton, who was in here earlier and is unable to ask now. But just a clarification with our amazing Transform TO climate change action plan. There was a couple figures bouncing around, and I think there could still be some confusion. It was 6.7 million, and now it's 2.5. And just to clarify why that is and how we are still fully funding it at 2.5.
Thank you, Councillor. I think perhaps the best way to look at answering that question is to look in terms of the resources that the budget is supporting. So when we put the numbers together back a year ago, we were contemplating over a 3 or 4 year period of hiring about 52 people to implement the measures that we identified in Transform TO. When you look at the budget that we put forward today, we believe that that's pretty much the same thing. We've got 6 people approved by Council in 2017. The budget before you this year has 27 people in 2018 and a further 10 in 2019. When you add to that, shelter support and housing had an addition of 3 people, which are provincially funded. That gets us up to, I believe, 45. When you look at things that have changed, social development and housing had a request for staff, but they got a grant from the province in the order of $300 million, so they don't need that anymore. One position was converted from staff, or from an FTE to consulting, and Fleet reduced their requirement from 4 people a year ago to 2 today. So when I add that up, I get 52 people, which is basically what we had in the budget last year.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McMahon. Councillor Byla, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. With the 11 additional shelter sites, how many beds are you hoping to get net open this year?
Through the chair. So this year there would be a total of 361 new beds, and there's 170 replacement beds also. And then on top of that, the 700 respite sites. So in total, in terms of places for people to be sheltered, there'd be 1,231 spaces.
Okay, great. And that is accounted in the capital and in the operating side of the equation, correct?
Through the chair, that's correct.
Great. With the TCHC, we do have an updated briefing note with regards to this special task force from the fire department. That is not included in this budget, correct?
That's correct.
And this is complementary to the work that TCHC is doing internally on fire prevention and fire education, correct?
So the fire chief's here, if you would like.
Through the chair, absolutely it is, Councillor.
So this will have, so Toronto Fire would have a dedicated task force to work with TCHC on fire inspections and fire prevention. That's what this request would translate into.
Through the chair, this would provide us the dedicated resources to expand our annual inspection service levels to include a number of different occupancy types that are currently only inspected on complaint to request. It would also give us initial funding to work in collaboration with Toronto Community Housing on a long-term and wide-reaching fire safety education and public marketing strategy, again, in collaboration, hand in hand.
Okay, great. The budget also includes, I believe, Budget Committee, and I just want to confirm, the money for the TTC to increase capacity on the on-peak times for bus routes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in some routes, we would need to have some garages ready, including the McNichol garage, for example, to increase capacity on some routes like the Dufferin route. Is there, when do we expect that to be ready?
Well, they're coming. My understanding that the funding that's been recommended is based on existing bus.
Through you, Chair, the McNichol Garage is anticipated opening up in the middle of 2020.
And is it fully funded?
That's correct.
So we will be able to further increase capacity on these routes once we have the new buses and the garage?
That's correct. Basically, what we have right now is the November award for additional buses increases the number of buses in the fleet by 80 vehicles in 2019. And that's what we're capitalizing on now.
We dev those garages. Would we be able to increase capacity on some of those routes?
Without McNichol, no.
Okay, thank you.
Long term.
Thanks, Councillor Bailão. Members of the committee wishing to ask questions on round number one? I have. Didn't you ask questions already, Councillor Pazio? Second round. I'm going to ask them on the first round. I wanted to give everybody else a chance first. Can I just ask a few questions? I'm not sure who could answer them, but I just want to go through, because Councillor Robinson was asking about the staffing, and I just want to go through, you know, it was a couple of these items were mentioned, but I want to just go through what that staffing is about. Can somebody confirm for me 27 of the people are bus operators?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So you can just tell me that I'm right in these numbers. 27 are bus operators, bus drivers, in other words, to deal with overcrowding and other issues. Is that correct? Okay. The head shake doesn't reflect on the to the rest of the room.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. 5 paramedics.
In fact, there are 14 in the budget.
Okay. 6 fire inspectors. I think part of that program we were just hearing about to increase fire safety at TCHC buildings, among other things.
That would be correct, if Councillor.
80 police officers.
That is an assumption in the fire budget.
16 traffic wardens to help manage traffic congestion in the busiest intersections.
Yes.
18 shelter workers to work in the shelters that are also provided for in the budget.
In fact, it's funding for 35 half year.
Okay. 22 recreation workers, which includes in part the people necessary to look after the 22,000 or 20,000 new recreation spaces we're creating.
Correct.
To try and get the wait, that's getting down a wait list, I think, isn't it, on recreation spaces?
It's helping to address the unmet need.
Okay. 9 Toronto Community Housing Special Constables Community Safety Unit to make Toronto Community Housing neighborhoods safer.
Yes.
11 Toronto Community Housing maintenance and cleaning positions to help with the maintenance.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
3 nurses to help in the public health with immunization and other things.
That's correct.
Okay. And then 32 lifeguards, because we're taking responsibility from the police for that so that they can free up more of their time to deal with police matters.
That's correct. In the spring?
Okay. And 5 employees for the quick clear squads to help move traffic better in the city?
Yes.
Okay. So that's just some of the, those are all correct, all those
are correct.
Positions that are being created for those purposes?
Yes.
Thank you. Just on the reserves, it was mentioned earlier on that we're doing some drawdown. Would I be correct that when we draw down from reserves, assuming the city, maybe you could just tell me, first of all, is the city anticipating, I know these numbers aren't finalized, is the city anticipating a surplus for this year?
Through the
For the 2017, I'm talking about.
Yes, in fact, we reported out at council, the Q3 variance report suggested that at the time we were projecting a $110 million surplus.
Okay. And is there any reason to believe that number's gone down since the Q3 reporting?
There's no reason to believe that it's gone down or up.
Okay. And under council policy, am I right that some of that money, I think it may be 25% of a portion of it anyway, a substantial sum, is used to replenish reserves? Yes, that is in fact correct. The council adopted policy allows for the CFO to allocate up to 25% of the reserve of the surplus into reserve funds. So it is likely that some of the reserves that are being drawn down in order to cause the budget to balance with the new and enhanced expenditures will be replenished by the surplus from the previous year. Yes, Mr. Mayor. Would I be right in some of the years going back, you know, before my own period here, that the surplus, in fact, was used to balance the budget? Would I be right if we go back to maybe 2011 and 12 or in around that time?
Yes.
And how much money would have been used at that time to balance the budget? Are we talking 100 million or 300 million, or how much was it?
We peaked up above $300 million.
So 300 million of a surplus was used at that time in order to balance the budget.
That's correct.
Okay, and under council policy now, that goes to capital reserves and so on, but also to replenish some of these reserves we've just been discussing.
That's correct.
So again, some of the reserves that will be drawn down upon will be replenished after you finalize your year-end statements for 2017. Yes, we expect to do so in April or May of this year. Okay. And I had one more question in that regard. Just if you could take me through, and I guess it is on the slide you happen to have up here, whatever, slide 37. If you looked at the sort of bridging strategies as they come to be called here, could you just talk about how those bridging strategies compare to other years that are shown on this slide and even going before? Just in terms of the degree to which we've relied upon those to bring us to a balanced budget.
Right. So as you can see, we've segmented them between the blue, which are reserve draws, and so you can see the variability there in terms of the reserve draw use versus the use of other kinds of expenditure items for the purposes of the balancing the budget. I think the most notable one in 2015 is that $72 million of the whole 110. And that was essentially the reduction, the one-time reduction that we did to capital from current to deal with the loss in the Toronto pooling compensation. So we've had to use a few of these strategies in the past.
So would I be correct in what we did in that year that showed quite a bit of higher number on these bridging strategies was we took a loss of revenue, which as I recall was $86 million, maybe it was more, and we spread it out over time so that the impact on the city's finances would be spread out over time, and that's why you see that big spike in that year.
That's correct, Mr. Mayor, and this budget actually deals with the last piece of that.
So we've now, as of this budget, using a bit of that, I'll call it that gray area we see, or I get, no, it's not the gray area. Yes, the gray area finishes that off. It spread it out over that time, including this year, and now it's done. And that even with that, which is really taking something back from 2015 up to 2018, we have a number. How would you describe where the number ends up at 76 million between reserve draws and one-time items relative to the other years that you see here, or years that you would look at before, including the use of surpluses in previous years?
So compared to the use of surplus, this is still a smaller number because we had a fair amount of work that we did as a city, as staff, to eliminate that surplus from as a revenue source. So you can see, relatively speaking, that on the expenditure side, 52 million, on the reserve side, 52 million is really kind of one of the higher numbers that we're seeing, but it is in response to, a critical situation as a city that we have faced. And on the expenditure side, in terms of deferrals, it's much lower. So, presumably next year we'll address the replenishing of the reserve and making sure that the shelter system is more sustainable on a tax funded basis, and then these strategies should come down.
Thank you. That was reached 10 minutes, which is 2 times 5, the previous person plus myself, so my time is up. Are there any other questions on round one, as it were? Any other councillors, members of the committee or not, who wish to ask questions? Does that mean we need to have a round two? I mean, if people want to have, I think Councillor Pasternak or Councillor Palacio had, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Within the child care aspect, recently the provincial government, they made an announcement to create as many child care spaces throughout the province. So my question is, within City of Toronto, do we have the numbers of how many spaces will be created within City of Toronto, and how much was allocated for that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, over the next 4 years, between spaces funded by the province, the federal government, and city contributions, we'll be creating about 5,000 additional spaces.
5,000?
5,000 to serve children from birth to age 4.
And that's within how many years?
Within the next 4 years.
Next 4 years. Now, and that's with the contributions, the provincial and federal contributions.
That's correct,
now,
as well as some municipal contributions through our capital budget.
Now, is there a ratio in terms of creating subsidized spaces that are, as you know, very much needed in City of Toronto, and that's, at least that's what I hear in my community every day, that they need subsidized spaces, not as much as the creation of childcare spaces.
Yes.
How are we doing?
The target is that 40 to 50% of all, there's be subsidies available to address 40 to 50% of spaces created. We are on track in doing that through our growth strategy, again, through investments from the 3 orders of government.
Do you
We
have...
we are introducing a number of new subsidies this year. We're introducing 550 for school-age children and 825 from children from birth to age 4.
Thank you. Do you have the breakdown per ward?
We're looking at how those are allocated per ward. We can get that for you. I don't have it with me.
Another question is that's for the TTC in terms of the 2-hour time and transfer system. And how much the allocation within the budget? It tells us $11 million. Is that for the whole year, or is that for part of the year?
Sorry, can you just repeat your question?
With regards to the 2-hour time-based transfer, and that's there is an allocation within the budget of $11 million. Is that for the whole year or just for part of the year?
11 million is for part of the year. Part of the year, yeah. It's for part of the year.
Part of the year. When does the program start?
Well, we're hoping by August of this year.
I'm sorry, when?
August of this year.
August.
We're working with
Fantastic.
Metrolinx to get the capabilities up.
What are the benefits of this program, and apart from increasing the ridership and also assisting the local BIAs and commercial strips, is there any other benefits citywide?
Through you, Mr. Chair. The benefits to the customer, the opportunities to get on and off transit as much as possible during a 2-hour time frame. There's been many customers are much focused on the fact that it's inconvenient for people to pay and then have to get off and then have to pay again. So it's a huge individual benefit financially to the riders. Increase the ridership as well.
There was public consultation on this. Did we have public consultations on this? And if so, what was the feedback from the communities?
We have had community consultation in the past, and it's always been very good feedback. This is something that's been asked for years.
Great. And there are plans to extend this program in the future as well, right?
That's correct. It would be annual in 2019.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. No further questions, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Palacio. Councillor Burnside.
Thank you. Through you to the fire department. We're good to go?
He's
Thanks.
there.
So we heard that the average resident on Toronto Island pays $900 in property tax. What's the cost of providing service annually to the 300 or so residents? Well, actually, let me rephrase that. Per property, what's the cost?
Through the chair, based on approximately 300 homes, it's about $9,000 per household per year.
So the property tax paid is about 10% of just the cost of providing the fire service, correct? 900, 9,000? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Burnside. Other questions in the second round? Councillor Robinson.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I missed council last week, but poverty reduction was before council. And one of the questions I wanted to ask, and what I noted through the report, is that things weren't being measured. And I just wonder how we improve or we address issues if we're not measuring these initiatives and programs. So if somebody could address the measuring.
Through the mayor, specific initiatives and programs are certainly measured. And we do report on outputs from those. The report talked about the evaluation of the strategy overall and the need to deepen our evaluation. There is a recommendation in this budget for resources to assist us in that overall evaluation of the strategy.
So generally, unless it's a head count, you're not measuring? Unless it's a head count issue where you can physically count participants, you're not measuring.
It would be more measuring the impact of a program on participants. So not simply outputs, but also program outcomes from different initiatives.
Okay, and to Parks and Recreation, It was some time ago, I feel like maybe a year or so, at council, we were talking about your registration process. You were indicating that a lot of people sign up for programs and then don't actually attend the programs. And you had no way at the time to measure that because there was no way to calculate it or compile that information. We're now adding a number of spots here. It looks like 20,000. Have you addressed that issue?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, we've tried to address that issue with the manual processes that have been implemented over the last year, which includes tracking when individuals attend programs, and if they're not attended within the first 3 classes, contacting them, asking them to withdraw, and bringing people in from the waiting lists. So we are addressing it as best we can. Currently, we're hoping that when we implement our new registration permitting software, that there will be some automation of that process.
So when would you be implementing the permitting software?
It's currently in the RFP process, and we'll be making a recommendation in June around the recommended proponent.
So it continues to be an issue that people are signing up and then actually not, and in some cases the programs are free and they're not actually attending.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, we've reduced it, the actual percentage. I can get for you and get you some specific statistics on it, but it has gotten better over the last year.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Councillor Robinson. Other questions on the second round of staff? I might just ask a couple, then I'll reset the clock if I can. Just on, again, the last line of questioning, because I want people to be very clear who are watching or who are looking at the record later. Do we have some doubt about whether about the veracity or the accuracy of the waiting lists, which are frankly, in excess of 20,000 new recreation spaces? I happened to be there to announce the 20,000, and it was spread across swimming, as I recall, summer camps. Just let's pick swimming and summer camps as 2 examples. On the swimming, if you take into account the fact there may be some people who sign up and don't show up, is there still a waiting list for many swimming programs across the city in different areas?
Mr. Mayor, there certainly is.
And are we convinced it's real? I mean, as opposed to some illusory thing, or because people sign up and cancel, or and don't cancel?
We believe it's real. We estimate that some of the fluidity on the waiting list may be around 10%, based on people double booking themselves on various wait lists, as an example, waiting for a chance to get into a program. So there may be some repetitive wait list users, but there certainly is a real need and a real capacity issue.
So if we just pick for illustrative purposes your 10% number, and I'm just trying to go from memory here, what was the total waiting list number that I talked about last week? 190,000, I believe. So that would take 19 off that, which would leave us with 171.
Correct. Yeah, that would be correct.
If you discounted it by 50%, you'd still have almost 100,000 people waiting.
That's correct.
And am I correct that you've categorized, so the programs, the 20,000 spaces that are added are not just being added kind of across the board, but they're being added in particular in response to the areas of the greatest apparent waiting list? That's
correct, Mr. Mayor. So we've looked at the areas of the city by district where those waiting lists are, and we'll be proportionately allocating the additional spaces based on where the wait lists are greatest in those areas of the city, proportionately based on a percentage of the total 20,000 spots.
Thank you very much. Other questions in the second round? Because otherwise we would move to speeches. Okay, going once, going twice. All right then, those wishing to speak, I don't have a list at the moment. Councillor Crawford will speak first as the budget chief, and thank you very much to our public service colleagues for answering those questions. Much appreciated. Councillor Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Manager, or Mr. Mayor. I have some motions I'd like to put forward, please, if I could have them up. Just want to maybe just put my time on hold till we get those up. Some of these are procedural, some of these are some of the additional reports that have come to us out of budget, so I just wanted to, I have to formally move them. The first one is that the recommendations in items EX 31.2A1 and EX 31.2AJ be adopted. And that second one, with respect to the item PG 25.4 prioritization of outstanding heritage conservation district areas, and interim protective measures that we're going to be adding 120,000, 22,000 gross, 0 net. The third one, that City Council amend the Toronto TTC's 2018 budget recommendations complement to reflect the 27 positions. That has to do with the a budget item that was already in there. We're just identifying the 27 people. The next one is that the Fire Services Budget Committee recommendations be increased by $806,000. That has to do with a budget report on increasing fire safety at TCHC buildings. And then the last one is recommendations 3 to 10 in the letter January 23rd, 2018 from the Budget Committee to be adopted. So those are the motions that I will be moving. Before I begin, I need to thank staff on the incredible amount of work that they've done. The budget process, and I've been involved in this in 4 years, really starts almost the day after we actually balance and bring the budget into place. So it's almost a 12-month period that they go through, and I just wanted to thank them for that. I also want to thank the Budget Committee for an incredible amount of work that they've been doing over the last 3 or 4 months. And of course, and we don't always mention this, but the public. The fact that we have had a lot of public deputations all across the city and given the public their opportunity to input information into the budget. So I want to thank them. And on with staff. The beginning of the process, they brought us a balanced budget. And they did incredibly hard work, not only this year, but I think over the last 3 years that has enabled them to get to a balanced budget. They've looked at efficiencies, they've looked at modernization, they've looked at how do we transform this city into a 21st century city, different ways of delivering services. And really when you look at the sort of prudent management that really needs to take place when you're running a city this size, they have done that. And I think what they've also done is they've found the balance that is very much inherent as part of this budget. So I want to thank them. This is a good news budget. Toronto is a robust and growing city, and we are seeing the benefits in this budget today. For the 4th year in a row, we've been keeping property tax rate at or below the rate of inflation. We are keeping taxes, we are keeping life in the city affordable for the residents of this city. But at the same time, we are holding our line on taxes. But at the same time, what we're also doing, and you've seen it in this budget, we are investing in the city, which is another key component of moving this city forward. In this budget, we have over $50 million of key investments all across the city. We also, and we talk about the importance of the capital work that needs to happen. In this budget, we have over an extra $1 billion of new investments that we're doing all across the city. 90% of the new and enhanced that have come to us through the process, we have been able to include into the budget. That's at $50 million. That 90% has increased to about 20% when we had a budget about 4 years ago at the beginning of this term. We weren't able to put in the kind of investments we wanted. But through the work that our staff and I think the Budget Committee have been doing, we've been able to put in over 90% of those new and enhanced items. And I'm going to go through some of those items. We've heard a lot of them already, but I just want to highlight a few of them. When you're looking at the TTC, 2-hour time-based transfers that are going to be starting this year, on top of the fare fees. We have a fare pass. We're dealing with overcrowding in the system. Millions and millions of extra dollars have gone into the TTC. When you look at our poverty reduction strategy, that is a council-approved poverty reduction strategy, we are in this budget putting in all of the recommended initiatives that have to take place this year. And that, of course, includes no Toronto community housing units that will be closed, over 1,000 shelter beds, more child care spaces, additional youth hubs and libraries, and that's just to name a few. We're giving in this budget the Auditor General more money so she can go back and look for more savings that we need to find so we can continue the kind of investments we want to do. Of course, we're fully funding Transform TO. We're adding 20,000 more at recreational spaces, 10,000 more that was anticipated with the budget from the city manager. We're accelerating the commitment to Vision Zero, which is incredibly important to the residents across this city. We are also increasing arts funding to $25 per capita, and we're beginning a process to grow our investments in the arts over time. So this is a
budget that is affordable to the residents of the city. It is keeping property taxes low, but at the same time, it is investing in the incredibly important programs that we need to do across the city. So I just want to thank and congratulate everyone on the Budget Committee and, of course, staff for what we're doing in moving forward to Council in a couple of weeks on, from my perspective, a very good news budget for the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Crawford, and thank you for your hard work and leadership on this too, in terms of the time spent, which I know has been very substantial as the budget chief. Other members of committee. I didn't ask, by the way, and I apologize, for members of the council. You asked to speak first, and you did, but if I can revert back to members of the City Council who are here with us, not members of the committee who wish to speak, we can go to Councillor Nunziata next.
Yes, thank you. Just briefly, first of all, I want to thank the budget chair and all the budget members that participated and city staff as well. As Councillor Crawford mentioned, we had numerous meetings and we had public deputations throughout the city. And when we went through those public deputations, we did hear loud and clear that there was a very strong advocate to put back the new and enhanced that were not part of the budget. And I'm pleased to say that we did put it all back into the budget. We also heard from some residents as well, and we do that every year, and from some members of council that in fact they want to put more back into the budget and increase property tax. But I feel that the budget that we have today is affordable, and I think it addresses all the concerns that we heard during the public consultation meeting. So I do support that the budget that we have before us.
Thank you, Councillor Nunziata. I see Councillor Fillion here. Are you wishing to speak, Councillor? No, thank you. Okay. Do I see other members of council? I don't see any wishing to speak. Otherwise, we can revert back to members of the committee wishing to speak, and I see Councillor McMahon.
Thank you very much. And I'm echoing the accolades for budget staff, city staff, everyone involved. Look at the full house here today of smiley faces, their favorite place to be. And of course, the Budget Committee and the Budget Chair, Gary Crawford, who I think has his Hawaiian trip book for right after Council. I think this is a great news budget, and especially from a sustainable point of view, from an environmental point of view. And I just wanted to do a big shout out to the Transform TO team under Josie and Jim Baxter's leadership, and with Toronto Atmospheric Fund. They've done great work to put us, bring us back to kind of Toronto the green again. So we are fully funding our Transform TO climate change action plan, which we should, and we are a role model to other world-class cities, and so we should be. And I just want to talk about the great things we're doing with Transform TO. We are advancing all our approved strategies and the 3 acceleration campaigns, which include mobilizing low-carbon neighborhoods, workforce development for high-performance buildings, and exploring the implications and opportunities for electric mobility. We are hiring, so everyone dust off your resume and think about if you're environmentally conscious, think about applying. We are hiring 12 new people in April 2018. I think the hiring process is underway for Better Building Partnership, retrofits of private sector buildings, energy conservation, demand management, our HELP program, the Home Energy Loan Program, and other advancing Transform TO strategies, stakeholder engagement and neighborhood outreach, and low-carbon thermal network. We're also hiring 15 new people in July of this year and 10 next April 2019. And as you heard today from staff, we received some big dollars from the province that will go a long ways to help as well. So it's all good news. You can sleep easy tonight, and so can David Suzuki. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor McMahon. Others wishing to speak? Councillor Pasternak.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have one motion. There were two, but I'm just going to move motion B. We were always under the impression when the University of Spadina Extension opened, somewhere in the vicinity of 200 buses would be taken off the road. We want to see whether that is in fact correct off those routes and whether that capacity has been put onto overcrowding routes, and we're expecting a report back by City Council. I'd just like to echo the thanks to the Budget Chief, to our city staff, and of course the Budget Committee. I used to sit on the Budget Committee, some of the most fond memories, it's a lot of work, a lot of hours dealing with an enormous array of complex issues. Looking at the budget before us, there is some concerns about our debt ceiling, concerns about staffing levels, but in general, it's a good, strong budget that I think will meet all of our service needs across the city, as well as the ability to keep property tax increases at the rate of inflation. We all know that we have an aging population, and more seniors want to age in place. They want to stay in the home that they've lived in for many years. Putting upward pressure on the property tax would force them out of their homes, something that is something we don't want to see. At the same time, young couples to get going. We know housing costs are very expensive, but we don't want to add to that with enormous property tax increases. So we want young couples to move to the city, to get going, to own their own home, and we also want our seniors population who've contributed so much to this great city not to be pushed out of their homes. So the tax rate is where it should be, and any kind of motions at council to increase that would in fact be detrimental to both the young people in the city who want to own their own homes and our seniors. On the housing side, just following up on my questions, if we have somewhere in the vicinity of 600 units that are uninhabitable within our TCH portfolio, and we're not allocating significant funds to get those in a good state of repair, that is a very serious matter, because embedded units within a multi-unit facility will spread the deterioration to other units, whether it be mold, whether it be infestation, whether it be other problems. It should be a priority not only to create that inventory of housing that's been taken off to restore it, but also to make sure it's in a good state of repair so that it doesn't affect the health and safety of the wider building, and I'll be pursuing this issue at council. Clearly, on the daycare side, our daycare policy is robust. The goal over the next 4 years of 5,000 spots with 40 to 50% subsidized is a major social goal. It is perhaps the most constructive social policy of the last generation, where it gives families the great opportunity to either go back to school, to work. We all know what daycare provide, and certainly as a father of 4, I can tell you that affordable daycare is a major priority throughout the city. Regarding our supportive housing and our shelter system, City Council and the committee that I chair have passed numerous motions that we hope the city manager will ensure that they come back to council with a good framework on how we can fix what needs fixing within our shelter system, and how we can make it more comprehensive, not only as a roof over heads, but also as a way to help people, some of the most challenged people in society, get fresh starts. So I think that council has spoken with 26 motions in December. Numerous councils came out of community development and recreation. And of course, the funding envelope is here too, to not only expand the shelter system, to extend it through more months of the year. And of course, our new agreement with the province of Ontario for various medical and mental health supports is transformative. So from those three policy, the housing, the daycare, and the shelter. I think we've got it right here. On the tax side, we've got it right. And once again, I thank the mayor and the budget chief and city staff and the budget committee members for doing a fine job, and I look forward to the discussion at council.
Thanks, Councillor Pasternak. Others wishing to speak? Councillor Ainsley.
Thank you, Mayor Tory. I want to start. I have a motion I'd like to move. It's basically a technical amendment to something that was passed at the Transportation Committee in the fall. This has to deal with two bridges that I'm trying to get built along with Councillor DeBearmaker in the Highland Creek ravine system between Military Trail and Centennial Campus. As a bit of a background, if you're at the south end of Centennial Campus, you can actually go to a sign that says Morningside Park this way and it points south. Morningside Park, you would have to wade across Highland Creek at least twice before you ever get to Morningside Park. These bridges were washed out a number of years ago and they were never replaced, but I was told I had to make some technical amendments to the motion around the cycling network plan. There's no money committed in this budget. It's basically looking at how we can move forward on this project. So to the budget, I want to thank the Budget Committee for all the work that they've done bringing this budget forward. I know, as somebody that sat on the Budget Committee under former Mayor Miller, I know it's never easy. It's a lot of work. There's numerous meetings you don't ever get credit for or recognized for. So I want to thank them for all their hard work. Saying that, though, I also want to recognize the challenges that we still have before us. And I'm going to speak on a bit of a personal note. As a city councillor from Scarborough, I have 5 priority neighborhoods in my ward. To get here this morning, most days when I come to City Hall, I take the GO train back and forth from Gilwood Station and I walk up Bay Street. Today when I walked up Bay Street, it was frigid. I couldn't get up Bay Street fast enough. But as I walked up Bay Street from Union Station, on both sides of Bay Street, I passed 8 homeless people. You know, homelessness in this city is still a huge issue, and it's not something that's just in the downtown core. In my own ward, I have people sleeping in Morningside Park. I have people sleeping under a bridge at Lawrence and Galloway Road. I know my transportation staff have issues with keeping people from living in the bridge because they can't find suitable accommodations. So, you know, I know we put beds forward in this budget, but it's still a huge challenge, and I know when it's going to be worked at, but I would like to recognize that. TTC. People that live in my ward in the priority neighborhoods often talk about how difficult it is for them to get buses downtown. When they get on the subway, it's very crowded. I know that we put money once again towards that, but I think it's something that we need to continue to work at. I appreciate all the money we put into TCHC, but I get regular calls from my buildings about elevator service and how long it takes elevators to get repaired. I had one building in my ward, it took 2 months. They had 3 out of 4 elevators out of service, and it took close to 3 months before they were all fully operational again. Parks and Recreation, I want to thank staff and my colleagues for all the work we've done in recreation programming, but as the general manager outlined, we still have a huge waiting list that we are trying to bring down. But as you're trying to get kids off the street, get them studying, doing something than just hanging around on the street corners, loitering, as many people often complain about, getting that waiting list down, because those are a lot of people that live in our TCHC and low-income housing. That's another priority that I'm going to continue to watch and make sure that we can look after. Saying that, I want to thank everybody on the Budget Committee once again for their work, Mayor Tory for your guidance on our budget, and I hope that my motion that I put forward can be supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ainsley. Others wishing to speak? Well, I will just say a few words if I might then. First of all, and I'll just reset the clock here, first of all to extend my thanks as I've done already, but I want to echo everybody's words to the city staff who work on this all year, and to the Budget Committee who work on it most of the year, and especially the Budget Chair, Councillor Crawford. Why anybody would volunteer for this job, I don't know, but it's a tough job. It's one of the toughest, you know, because again, you know, this is the place where you know, put the money behind the statements, and I want to just speak to that because I think it is a budget that achieves what we have set out to do, which is, on the one hand, and I'll come back to this, to make sure that we do our best to make sure the city remains affordable, and that this year is accomplished by things such as the tax increase being kept again for the 4th year to the rate of inflation, but also by things like the TTC fare freeze, which has taken place this year. But at the same time, recognizing that we have a responsibility, in fact, coming off some of the comments that Councillor Ainslie just made, to make investments in the city. And we're making investments in transit and traffic as we must. This is not just a city that had traffic and transit problems that had largely been ignored in terms of significant investment for a number of years, but it's a city that's rapidly growing. City that's rapidly growing, so that when we introduce things such as improved bus service, or when we introduce things like a low-income fare pass, 2-hour transfer, traffic wardens, smart signal technology, these are investments we make that have a cost. I talked earlier on and asked some questions of staff about the positions that go with them: 27 bus operators, 80 police officers, 16 traffic wardens, 5 quick clear squad employees, and so on. These are to make life better in the city on traffic and transportation, which is a major challenge for people. It's a major issue with respect to the economy, and it's a major issue with respect to equity, because people who can't find their way easily to a job won't find it as easy to be in a job. And I think there are equity issues that relate to that. Secondly, we're making significant investments in housing and in the shelter system. And of course, our preeminent challenge has to be to improve the supply of affordable housing and supportive housing. I think where we are with respect to mental health, and I've said this a number of times, I'm going to keep saying it, I'm going to say it at the Big City Mayors meeting coming up this month, we're going to be doing everything we can to continue to raise the profile of the mental health issue, because there are hundreds of people staying in our shelters at night where not only is that occupying shelter capacity, that's not the issue. The issue is that is not the right place for them to be in a city that would hold itself out as humane and in a health system that would hold itself out as caring for people who need help. You wouldn't say to somebody who had a heart condition, well, you know, just stay at home or go to a shelter and rest up and hopefully things will get better. You take them to the hospital and you treat them, or you take them to some kind of a clinic and you treat them. And so we're making investments in shelter. There will be a continuing discussion about whether it's enough, but I've shown myself, and a number of members of council have, willing to look at the situation as it evolves and make additional investments, and this budget provides for those. The budget, and it's been little noted, the budget provides for $270 million investment in repairing Toronto community housing. And in the past, there were various mechanisms used on the resources of Toronto Community Housing itself to mortgage and remortgage and refinance, but now you have the city saying that is ultimately our responsibility as the shareholder of that corporation. And more importantly than whether we're the shareholder of the corporation, we are the city government that oversees the life of those residents who live in those units. And this will allow us not to close units otherwise that would have had to be closed in 2018. And I remember people on council predicting that the end of this budget, the ultimate sort of end of its ability to be successful would be when we had to come to grips with the Toronto Community Housing Capital. And on top of that, for the first time, the redevelopment of the George Street shelter there, which will replace Seton House and be something that's much better in terms of both a shelter and long-term care for aging residents. Councillor Pasternak referred to demographics. Is in the budget, in the capital plan. In the capital plan. Millions in additional shelter space, continuing affordable housing initiatives, investments in the quality of life, and that includes 80 police officers to take account of some concerns that have come up during the course of the modernization of the police forces. 20,000 rec spaces. You heard the general manager talk about the fact those waiting lists are real. I know they're real because people talk to me about them on the street every day, and those are, as Councillor Ainslie said, programs that kids will enroll themselves in if they can and have them doing better things than perhaps they might otherwise be doing. Poverty reduction, library hours, student nutrition, child care, 550, I think, new subsidies in this year's budget. Transform TO, a historic environmental initiative for the city. And then if you look at the metrics of the budget, property tax at inflation, operating spending on cities and agencies under 3%, leaving aside debt service. Debt service is going up, but you know why? Because we're doing things. We're doing things that city councils in the past postponed doing. And so, yes, debt service costs are going up because we're investing in a growing city, a city with significant challenges. And so I'll just finish, if I may have, if I can have the Deputy Mayor grant me an extra 30 seconds. You know, I told my kids for years, and I now tell my grandchildren the story of the 3 bears. And you remember it was the porridge was too hot and the porridge was too cold and the porridge was just right. Well, I have some councillors and other critics out there who say that we're not investing enough in the city. We're not spending or taxing enough. We should tax more and spend more. Then I have other councillors who say we're spending too much. And I think we've got this just right, in the sense that what we're doing is we've restrained the level of increase in property taxation to the rate of inflation 4 years in a row. 4 years in a row, and we've managed to make each of those years, including this year, very significant investments in the lives of the people who live in the city, the things they need, the transit system, better shelters, better housing, and better programs that affect their quality of life, including forward-looking things like Transform TO. I'm actually proud of that. I'm proud that we have struck that balance, which is exactly what I think people want us to do. It comes back to the three bears. You know, too much, too little, just right. And I think that we have got this just right in terms of that combination of investments needed to make a great city and making sure we keep it affordable by keeping the rate of increase in taxation to inflation, which I think is a reasonable metric at this point in our history. So I thank you for your attention, and I'll ask if there's anybody else who wishes to speak after that. Councillor Crawford.
I just had a quick technical amendment I have to move. Same one, it's just an addition from motion A, that recommendations in items EX 31.2A1, EX 31.2AJ, which I've already moved, and EX 31.2AL be adopted. So I just had to add that one report. So nothing changing, just one more report had to go in.
Thank you, Councillor Crawford. Now, we have a couple of people, Councillor Pasternak and myself, will have to pay attention as we go through here. We'll have to excuse ourselves for some of this because of declared interest. But, Madam Clerk, I'll rely on you to help me with where we start. Motion A, which we'll put up. So the motion is in front of you, and this is moved by the Budget Chair. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Motion B from Councillor Crawford as well, that these are some of the housekeeping motions he just put. This is in front of you. You can see it. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Motion C, similarly for the TTC. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Motion D, also coming from Councillor Crawford on the Fire Services TCHC program. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Motion E concerns the letter from the Budget Committee adopting recommendations 3 to 10 in the letter of January 23rd, 2018. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Next is Councillor Pasternak's motion that concerned the TTC and buses and the new subway extension. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Councillor Ainsley's motion concerning Centennial College and Military Trail and so on. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. So now we have the item as amended, and that's when we'll have to excuse ourselves at this point. Deputy Mayor will take the chair. Yes. Okay.
All right. Is that, there we are. Councillor Crawford's motion, all those in favor? Opposed? Carried. I'm sorry.
Part 1 to 4 of Councillor Crawford's motion, adopt item as amended.
Okay. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. 2, 4.
Part 5 of Councillor Crawford's motion.
Part 5, this is the item on which Councillor Pasternak has declared an interest and has left. So Part 5, all those in favor? Opposed? Carried.
And adopt the balance of the item.
And would this be the main vote then on the?
Yes, this is
all right.
the
Well, I will ask, if I may, Madam Clerk, for a recorded vote on Part 6, which is the adoption of the balance of the budget.
Those in favour of Part 5 of Part 6 of motion by Councillor Crawford to adopt the balance of the item as amended. Those in favour: Councillor Ainsley, Councillor Balau, Councillor Burnside, Councillor Crawford, Councillor McMahon, Deputy Mayor Minnan-Wong, Mayor Tory, Councillor Palacio, Councillor Pasternak, Councillor Robinson. Those opposed? Motion carries unanimously, Mr. Mayor.
Does that then complete our business? Well, thank you all very much, members of the committee and visiting members of council and staff, for all the work and for your attendance and work today. Thank you very much.